And welcome back to the Ocean Life Symposium. You're tuning in to KGUA 88.3 FM here on the Northern California coast and inland at KBVE 107.9. And today's Ocean Life Symposium is hosted by Miss Sherry Goforth. And we're on hour number, what are we going on for? Going on for. It's a full day of ocean life goodness. So, Sherry, who's next?
All right, thanks, Sevi. I'd like to take this moment to introduce Michael Stalker. We are just excited to have him here, and I'll read his introduction to you. Michael is the founding director of Ocean Conservation Research, a scientific research and policy development organization focused on understanding the impacts of and finding technological and policy solutions to the growing problem of human-generated ocean noise pollution. He's a technical generalist, conversant in physics, acoustics, biology, electronics, and cultural history, with a gift for conveying complex scientific and technical issues in clear, understandable terms. He has written and spoken about marine bioacoustics since 1992, presenting in national and regional hearings, national and international television, radio and news publications, and in museums, schools, and universities. His book titled Here, HEAR, Here We Are, Sound Ecology and Sense of Place, reveals how humans and other animals use sound and sound perception to establish their placement in their environment and communicate that placement to others. Michael is also a musician performing original compositions and jazz standards on the piano, vibraphone, flute, and bass. So, with that, thank you. I'll take it away.
Hi there, Sherry.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for the honor of inviting me here. Is this just radio or is there visuals also involved in it?
We are also we're both radio stations, but also on YouTube. We have visual.
Okay, hi, Tree.
People can tune into our KGUA public media on YouTube.
Great. So, but I will be a little bit more articulate vocally instead of just relying on pictures.
Sure.
But thanks again. This is really great opportunity here. And there's a lot of movement going on in the ocean right now, particularly because this administration has plans of turning it into money. And we have been working over the years. I've just been going over every 5 years, we have a 5-year offshore leasing plan, which is largely focused on oil development. But during the Biden administration, it was kind of opened up to offshore wind as well. And I've been just I'm trying to find the 2022 plan that the Biden administration put out. I was working on something else this morning because we went over essentially what happens is they have leasing plans for offshore outer continental shelf area that's under the jurisdiction of the federal government. And every 5 years, they put out a plan to figure out how we want to do that. And they have this whole process where they have public hearings and they put out a plan that we get to comment on. And then the draft environmental impact statement is reconsidered, given our comments, and reissued as a final, and then we get to look at it again and determine whether or not our concerns have been translated accurately from Bureau of Ocean Energy Management into a plan that the public is on board with. That's the typical order of things. But the 2022 plan, which included some offshore wind leasing and whatever, was not suitable to these folks who are beholden to the fossil, the petrostate. And so in 2025, this year, they put out another plan that basically opens up the entire, all four coasts of the continent to offshore drilling. And they did this in 2017 as well, but they had a fairly methodical way of doing it. They were going to start with the South Atlantic, go through the Gulf of Mexico, then they're going to hit the Pacific coast and then the Arctic. But working with Oceana, Southern Environmental Law Center, and North Carolina Surfrider, among others, we managed to gum up the works in the South Atlantic. So because they weren't able to basically lay that egg, the rest of the plan was thwarted. And I thought it was a pretty, we knew we had them when we had Republican congressmen giving noise demonstrations on the floor of the House. So um, they were upset about that. And so the 5-year plan that came out in 2022, because the Biden administration was not so beholden to fossil fuel, there was only 3 lease sales that were opened up in the Gulf, where essentially it was like a sacrifice zone. That's where they're drilling for oil in offshore, in the outer continental shelf. And those were only let out because Joe Manchin had held us basically hostage. The IRA was held hostage because he wanted to have more oil represented in the strategy of Americans' energy or energy strategy. But the offshore wind was something that was really opened up in a big way. And so they were planning on putting some 3,000 wind turbines on the Atlantic seaboard. And I have been working on that. We have been getting together with a consortia of various groups, NRDC and Earth Justice and Audubon and whatever, and concentrating our efforts on these offshore plans now so that we have kind of a harmonized strategy in terms of what what our concerns are, but also representing our expertise. I have an expertise which is pretty arcane, sorry, archaic too, but because I do marine bioacoustics, and pretty much every time you go into the ocean with some kind of a project, you're bringing noise in with you. So we have to figure out what the impact of that noise is and what type of mitigations we need to consider. And then there are other things, particularly when you're doing something as dramatic as the offshore wind plan, which was essentially going to completely transform the Atlantic seaboard. So you need to do longitudinal studies, figure out what kind of wildlife impacts are going to be, both from a habitat standpoint and a use standpoint. The big concern on the Atlantic seaboard is the North Atlantic right whales, because it's shallow on the Atlantic coast, and so most of the turbines would be anchored into the seabed through pile driving. And when you have millions and millions of pile driving strikes that are not what you call quiet, it's going to have some impact on the habitat there. And now, because opening up is this benthic idea of benthic vertebrates that basically live in the mud. And when you're pile driving in the mud, it's noise. It's just not noise through air or water. It's noise through mud. And so interfering with those guys is problematic. One of the examples up in the North Sea, where they have wind farms up there, they have these langoustine, which are essentially like small lobsters, and they burrow in these burrows. And the burrowing and their hunting for other things to eat, other invertebrates, they kind of fluff up the mud a bit. And the fluffing up of the mud allows that habitat to be inhabited by the other critters that are there. But what they found is that because of the noise of the turbines, and this could be the noise that's being transmitted down the mast into the mud, or it could be just the long-term process of pile driving that set this thing off, or both, or all of the above. The langoustine are not aerating the mud so much. And this is a problem because that North Sea is being fed with silt from the Thames and the Rhine and the Ruhr and all these different rivers, and that mud will settle. But if it's not fluffed up by the langoustine, it will turn into concrete at some point in time, and that would modify the benthic invertebrate communities up there. And who knows what impact that's going to have. So, offshore wind is a great idea in as much as we're, basically generating energy that's not generated by fossil fuel. We know that fossil fuel is killing the planet. But I'm not a huge fan of unplugging the pipeline and plugging the power cable and heading towards the same cliff. That being said, just recently, I think it was in July or so, the current administration decided to revoke all offshore wind permits. And there's some tussle with Empire Wind because Ørsted had been planning that for 9 years, and I think they were able to kind of restart that project, but they laid off 25% of their workers. So all the jobs and the manufacturing and everything else that was going to be associated with the offshore wind and the Atlantic seaboard is on pause for the moment. The problem with this is that this is coming out just as the AI craze is starting to take over, and AI uses a huge amount of energy. The plant that Meta is putting in Louisiana, in the north part of the state, will be eating up 3 times the energy of New Orleans. So that energy is got to come from somewhere. And herein lies a challenge, because all those wind farms are shut down, and it takes anywhere from 5 to 10 years to get a drilling operation productive, and particularly offshore. And so it looks to me like they're engineering an energy crisis, which will probably be visiting us in 3 to 5 years, unless something changes. And as we've seen, persuading the Americans to use less energy is thwarted by the people who are generating the energy. They don't want to do that. I mean, so you can get electric cars now. For example, you can get an all-electric F-150 Ford truck. It's got 6,000 pounds of batteries in it. That weighs more than my electric car does. I have an electric car. I'm happy about it, but this is not solving our problem. So that is kind of what's going on right now. And also in terms of the 5-year offshore leasing plan, they took comments on the 2025 plan. I didn't waste a lot of time on it because I knew that these guys were probably not going to read them anyways. And it turns out they did. They took 34,000 comments from the public, but instead of releasing a final plan, they're just running with it. And typical of this administration, unless we stop them, they're going to go. So the first thing that they're doing is they're opening up lease sales in the Cook Inlet, in Alaska, and also down in the Gulf, without having the public informed about how they responded to our comments. And I think part of what they're doing here is because they had this methodical, stomping ground effort that they did in the 2017 plan, that they're just going to scattershot this. They're just going to go everywhere they can, and we're going to have to challenge them on every single front. And one of the things that I heard from inside Scuttlebutt is that they are going to open up oil and gas leasing in the sanctuaries, in the national marine sanctuaries. If for no other reason to get up our noses on this stuff, they're just going to piss us off. So, we got a lot of work to do, and that is some of the things that we are involved in. I am trying to figure out how to strategize with our offshore coalition at this point in time because of this very, very discussion. Is that they're coming up with a different strategy, and they don't seem to pay attention very much to the law, the courts, public opinion. So it could be really messy. It will be really messy, and then I'm not sure in terms of the offshore wind thing. I have a paper coming out. I just finally submitted about the post-review edit of this paper, looking at offshore wind and the infrasonic noise that it generates when you have these large propellers spinning around, they create these blade vortices that they essentially the following blade will hit those, and that it thumps. And then there's also a static air, stagnant air in front of the mast, and when the blade passes that, it thumps. So it sounds like a helicopter, but it's a lot lower frequency. It's a lot slower. And you know how helicopters are. Sometimes you kind of get a premonition that it's coming before you actually hear it. And that is because it's infrasonic noise, which we can't really hear, but we can feel permeates the area around it. The concern I have with 3,000 wind turbines along the Atlantic seaboard, they also call it the Atlantic flyway. That's where some 30% of the birds that migrate between South America and the Northern Hemisphere fly along that flyway. And how do they navigate? How do they find out where they are, and how do they keep themselves safe from storms and things like that? They sense barometric pressure. And when the barometric pressure is unstable, they won't get up into the air because they are going to be buffeted by oncoming storms that are kind of unstable wind. But they will wait when there's a consistent decrease in barometric pressure, because when the storm is finally stabilized, they can get tailwinds of up to 200 miles an hour, and they can really make a lot of headway on that. And so that helps them out. The problem is that if you have essentially the area where they're sensing this barometric pressure, that low frequency stuff, completely cluttered with all this thumping of thousands of turbines, it may, in fact, confuse them. That was my concern. And that's what I expressed in the paper. I hope that that conversation gets out. It's typical of my, because I'm a systems guy, I think about stuff like this, and the biologists aren't thinking about it, and the physics guys, the physical oceanographers, are not thinking about it. But if you put those together, so I was talking to room full of ornithologists last year on this very issue, and after I mentioned it, they all kind of realized, oh gosh, the room went silent. What are we going to do now? And so the paper may be a blockbuster. It's going to be public domain. The way it works in science publication, that you have to pay for the privilege of getting your paper put in a journal, and if you want it public domain, you have to pay even more. So that's the way it works, but that's where we're going to do it. It's going to be worth it because I think we're going to basically hope, or hopefully change this conversation a little bit. The other challenge with this low frequency infrasonic long wavelength noise is that while we don't know for sure, the high probability that that baleen whales also use that long wavelength sound to navigate. They end up going, Chris Clark put out a paper. Unfortunately, it's, because you can't really prove it. You can only conjecture. There's no way to do a kind of take the evidence, take elements of way and see how it confuses things. So you can't really publish a peer-reviewed paper on this stuff. It's kind of informed speculation. But the paper that he put out was basically tracking humpback whales from the Arctic down to Hawaii, and humpback whales, like a lot of most baleen whales, they have a feeding area and they have a breeding area. And so the breeding and birthing area down in Hawaii is where they head to every year. But how do they get there? How do they find their way? I mean, they don't have eyes on the top of their heads, so they're not looking at the stars, and they don't necessarily have magnetic sensing. They could, but what Chris found is that they headed towards geological features in the ocean, a seamount over here, or a trench over here, or some ridge line here. So they kind of, it looked like they oriented towards things that they could be having acoustical artifacts in the surroundings, particularly that these animals make sounds that you can hear 2,000-3,000 miles away. They may be actually echolocating on these geological features in the ocean. And so if they are using this low frequency band to navigate, figure out where they are, again, if we have 3,000 turbines along the Atlantic seaboard cluttering that up, how is it going to impact their ability to navigate? And of course, the problem with this is, you can't do a null hypothesis thing on this. Once they start sticking them in there, tracking their ability to navigate, at what point in time do we notice that there's a problem? At that point in time, we're already pretty constructed out. There's not going to be, oh, let's start something else. Let's not do that. Let's put in the high-speed rail in the United States instead of automobiles or whatever. So it's a strategical thing that's we're talking about. Anyways, that's kind of what's one of the live things on my desktop right now. And another thing I'm working on is as we start industrializing the ocean, we get more and more complicated pieces of equipment out there. They have to communicate with each other, and you can't have wire everywhere because there's a lot of these things are dynamic. You have remotely operated vessels. You have all kinds of different drones and things like that in the ocean that are doing all sorts of sensing. So how they communicate, by and large, is acoustically. And let me see if I can share my screen here, and I will use it as a, and I need to share the sound as well if I'm going to do this properly. Okay. And slideshow from slide. There we go. Yeah, so for those of you who can see what's on the screen here, this is a bunch of equipment on the seafloor. This is essentially a seafloor processing factory, if you will, for offshore oil and gas. So they have essentially they pull this product up out of the ground, out of the deposits, and it has gas and brine and sand and oil and all kinds of other stuff in it. So they need to basically take the stuff out that they don't want, the sand and the brine, and they re-inject that back into the deposit, which helps pressurize the deposit, keeping it pressurized, but also they don't have to pipe that stuff up to the surface and figure out what to do with it then. So there's all this equipment on the seafloor, but this equipment, they have different states they need to announce, pressures and flow rates, and they have valves that need to open and shut, and they have all kinds of other complex things that need to be monitored, and they need to communicate these states up to the surface so that people who are operating this stuff know what's going on. And they do this through acoustic modems for the most part. I mean, there's some data that can come up and down parallel with the pipes, cable stuff, but there are other things that are that are a lot more dynamic, and they basically have these acoustic modems down there. And water is pretty opaque to radio frequencies, so they can't do that. And yeah, it's pretty much sound. I mean, that's what we're stuck with. Some electromagnetic stuff and what have you in close range, but sound is really it. And the problem with that, as it sits right now, is that the sounds that they use, because they have to have a very unambiguous state change between a yes and a no, a digital communication being what it is, these signals have very what we call hypertosis, or kind of jaggedy sounds. Some of the sounds are like this. Or This is another dulcet sound here. If I can play this. So these are not what I would like to hear in my household when I'm swimming around in my habitat. And I'm working with, so let's get out of here. I'm a member of the International Standards Organization, and we're working with the International Technical Commission Committee, our commission, and we're trying to come up with standards to have benign communication, biologically benign communication signals. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds on it. There are a lot of strategies that I'm trying to advance. The problem is that the ISO are essentially, scientists and biologists and whatever. We're trying to come up with workable standards for various reasons. The IEC is an industrial organization. They want to sell equipment. So we have to basically work with them to come up with solutions which are suitable for their technologies, and that they'll pay attention to, because they would rather just stick the stuff in the water and be done with it. So I'm working with a subcommittee, a working group, where we're talking about how do you define biologically benign underwater communication signals. And there's a number of different strategies. One of them is essentially transmit on query only. So you don't have a continuous stream of data when you don't need it. If you just need to figure out, what is it right now? What's going on? So those can't see the illustration here. It's a Marco Polo. You guys play that in the pool when you're a kid. You only say polo when Marco is, so the person knows, but all the other time it's quiet again. So it's essentially transmit on query only allows the density of noise density to be significantly decreased. So that's one of the strategies. The other is using biomimicry, because dolphins and other animals in the ocean use sound in ways that they can transmit vast amounts of information. But because these animals are already adapted to these types of sounds, it would be likely more biologically benign. For example, is beluga whales. So you hear a lot of layers in that. You hear these kind of social sounds and there's trilling going on. What you don't hear in this one that clearly is also the biosonar. But that's a group of maybe 10 belugas, and they're communicating their states to each other. And animals around, are used to that noise. It's not gonna, it may scare their prey, but aside from that, it's biologically benign. Another is something that's pretty much ubiquitous in all temperate waters is snapping shrimp. Let's get the snapping shrimp. Here we go. So this is pretty random stochastic noise, but if you can come up with ways of time correlating the data to windows of opportunity to listen to it, you can transmit a good amount of information using that type of a signal. And this is another one. These are minke whales that they basically they synchronize with each other like crickets, and so a signal like this, if you could just modulate slightly the distance between the pulses or whatever, that you can basically encode that in a number of different ways. Another one is frequency hopping spread spectrum. This is what makes our phones, we can have so many phone channels all broadcasting in the same bandwidth, because essentially when you establish a connection, you have a sequence of frequencies that basically hop around and do not interfere with other phones. So without having a huge amount of energy, you can have thousands of phones in a given area and convey all sorts of information. Um, that is up in the 3 gigahertz range, so you can get a lot more information, a lot more phones. But you can use that same strategy down in the auditory range, and because you're only looking for a piece of information when you know it's supposed to be there, it takes a lot less energy. For example, if I said that there was a $5 bill in my house, you could look for it all day long and wouldn't find it. But if I told you there was a $5 bill, it's going to be on the kitchen table at 3:30 this afternoon, you could find it without much effort at all. So that's really the idea. You treat data like that. You only look for it when you want to see it, and specifically at what time and space you're expecting it. And the reason why I have Lana Turner here is that she actually had the patent on this back in the 40s. And unfortunately, it never got used until after the patent expired. But the reason I know about this is that the SR-71, which is a spy plane, was a plane that no, it was Hedy Lamarr. Did I say Hedy Lamarr? Hedy Lamarr, yeah. George Antheil was her co-worker on that. George Antheil was a composer, and they basically came up with this idea when they're looking at a piano roll and saying, wow, we could use this metaphorically in a different way, and have the little holes in the paper represent frequencies, as opposed to piano notes. But yeah, my father designed the guidance system for this SR-71. It was a very fast airplane. It's over 3 times the speed of sound. And because it was a spy plane, they had to figure out how to communicate with it without letting anybody know where it was. And so they chose this spread spectrum frequency hopping technique, and they were able to broadcast, over the horizon on very low power, because they're only looking for data when it's available or when they're expecting it. And the FCC was kind of worked up in a lather about it. They knew they were communicating, and they didn't know which band, and they hadn't, Lockheed had not licensed a band to use. And so the FCC was saying, well, you got to license whatever, band you're using. And they said, well, you can hear it. We'll let you know. We'll do it. But they could never hear it because it was the energy level was so low. They were, I think, going over the horizon 600 miles on something like 500 milliwatts or something like that, maybe less than that. But it was pretty impressive. Anyways, that's really the strategy that I'm working with the ISO to come up with ways, analogs of this to work underwater communication, so that we have biologically benign communication signals that and will allow us still to increase the density of our communication channels down there. And the sweet dulcet sounds of a healthy reef is how I'm going to close this part of the argument. There we go. So yeah, that may end up being one of the kind of, if I can get, unfortunately, I've got some people who are working on the ISO committee who don't quite understand what I'm talking about. It drives me crazy, but we'll get it. We got 3 years to make it work. So I don't know. Is there a question thing or am I just freewheeling here?
Uh, excuse me. Questions will take by email, and then they'll email you in the future. So to remind our listeners of that link, it's oceanlifesymposium@gmail.com. That's oceanlifesymposium@gmail.com. And if we send them in, Tree will field questions and forward them to the appropriate presenter. So I have a quick question. So I may have mispronounced the title of your book, Here Where We Are, Sound Ecology and Sense of Place. Can you talk a little bit about the content of your book? And can you tell me, with your music background, as I was reading some of it, it seems like that it's informed by music and art as well as the heavy science. Is that true?
Yeah, no, it's a popular science book. It's not. The center chapter has more technical stuff in it, and when people get snagged on, I tell them just jump over that. But it's really a book about phenomenology of sound perception, and the first two chapters are how humans have used sound in terms of communication, but also sensing. Sound is really the way we perceive our surroundings, even when we're not making noise. And initially, because I was doing a lot of architectural acoustics back in the 90s, in public spaces, museums, and recording studios and things, but particularly in the public spaces and museums, um, I wanted to come up with I came up with a vocabulary to talk about how we perceive sounds and what those spaces we inhabit are used for. So, I had essentially workspaces, family spaces, sacred spaces, and public spaces, and they are all defined in terms of their, the sound that we perceive there. I mean, that if we think about sacred spaces, for example, we think about cathedrals, large uh, reverberant spaces that you essentially can hear both the largeness of this sacred surrounding that you're in and yourself in it. You're a member of that. You belong to that space. And so I wanted to write this book on architectural acoustics using that vocabulary. And one of the things I was doing, I was going over to Europe and going to some of these old sacred spaces, particularly these old Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries. But I followed this whole. I realized in the Cistercian monasteries that they were using irrational numbers in high precision, but also in high quantity. I mean, it's really amazing how many irrational ratios that you would find in these churches. And when you were in these churches, you could hear the church in your body. So when you sang, you would sing you would feel it in your heart. It was really an amazing thing. And I went to what I would do is I'd go to the very sacred spaces and I'd try to go there when the service was happening. I'd go before anybody started arriving, and then I'd just see how people would arrive and how they would inhabit the space. And it was quite amazing. I was at this Abbey Tournai in southern France, in Provence, and it happened to have been the day of the Assumption. This is when Mary, the Mother of Christ, was assumed up into heaven, into the sacred rose of the Holy Host. And I went there, and it's a place sounds beautiful. Just it sounds like the building is inhaling. It's just like it when you walk in, it sounds like it's inhaling. And the preacher started his sermon, and he was about half a sentence out before he started singing. And for the next 4 hours, it was all song. Just beautiful, really, and really moving. And I asked one of the nuns there, how do you use this space? And she says, we basically, because when you hear sound in your body from that place, you can hear where your anxieties and fears are, as well as your compassion and your love, and it's undescribable. But she said, we work with this, preparing ourselves for that day in eternity, and we'll be beholding the rose of the Holy Host for eternity. And I was like, it's a type of comfort that's hard to think about when living in our the troubled, tormented society. But I followed that the kind of the canon of irrational numbers used in sacred architecture from southern France, Spain, over to Italy, to Greece, to Turkey, and then down into Egypt. And so, unfortunately, as I was putting this book together, I realized I was going to have to explain how we perceive sound. And so I started writing that, and that started having a bar fight with the stuff on the architecture. And what came out of it was the Here Where We Are book, which talks about the phenomenology of sound perception in humans and animals, but the architecture part didn't really get in there. So, in my spare time before I pass on, I'll maybe write that book on sacred architecture and take it from there. But yeah, that's where the book was.
So there is a link between cathedrals and singing and choirs in cathedrals and humpback whales making noises in canyons and perhaps navigating based on noises and sound.
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, and what's interesting about humpback whales particularly is that they all sing the same song, so we typically frame or contextualize animal behaviors, including human behaviors, in terms of, breeding fitness announcement and territorial protection and things like that. They're all having to do with kind of conflict and outward relations with others. And these animals are singing the same song. So in terms of breeding fitness announcement, it's a hard argument to make on that. But I also like to remind people that the whales and dolphins that we have in the ocean right now have not physiologically changed for the last 6 million years. So, but evolution is one of the constants. So what has evolved in these animals may be their consciousness. And that is something that we there's a discussion now out about how AI is going to help us understand what whales are talking about for whatever reason. And we may be able to find, vocabularies that we can help define and associate with behaviors. But, like Norman Whitconsin said, if we could understand what they were saying, we wouldn't know what they were talking about. So, yeah, so that's it. I guess unless there's another question, I'd like to move on to another project we're working on.
Sure, that'd be great.
Yeah, okay. So let me share the screen again. And where is that one that I need to get to?
Yeah, we have a solid 10 minutes.
Yeah. Is it that one? No. Hold on a second. Let me get that. Sound of water. That's that one. I'm surprised it's not here. Hold on. Let me find it first on my regular screen here. And there we go. That's it. And we're gonna open this up. Share screen again.
Just to remind our listeners, you're listening to the 7th Annual Ocean Life Symposium presented by Scott and Tree Mercer of Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study, and you're listening on KGUA 86.3, KBVE in Boonville 107.9, and also tune in on YouTube. This will be recorded, but you can also watch live at our KGUA Public Media webpage on YouTube. Thanks.
So this is a project we're working on. The current administration is threatening to take away the nonprofit determinations of organizations that they feel are terrorists. And by their definition, because we are interfering with offshore oil and gas, we're terrorists. And so the ACLU is on this. We had a meeting with them a few months ago. We and 5,000 other nonprofit organizations concerned about it. But it's definitely in the offing that these guys are loony enough to try to pull it off. So one of the things, our backstops would be to come up with a product that is actually marketable in and of itself. And one of the things that I've been developing over the years is this whale identification system for ship strike prevention. And essentially what we're talking about doing is using a certain type of mathematical analysis called wavelet analysis that essentially the way that they identify whales, and a lot of you have probably seen, if you've maybe haven't, but seen basically these spectrograms or sonograms of signals in the ocean, and they do that through what's called fast Fourier transform, which is essentially taking this broadband signal and running it through a bunch of filters, and then expressing the amplitude of the output of that filter, which will give you an idea of how much any given frequency is going to have in there. The problem with that is those filters smear everything in the time domain, and as a consequence of that, you know it's a blue whale or it's a humpback whale or something like that because of the signature, visual signature of it, but you don't really know where it is. You can't really predict it. So you have essentially a probability map of where it is, but not exactly. What this particular product is, also, yeah, the ship strike problem, it's huge. Over 20,000 whales a year are struck and killed by ships. And it's both the propellers as well as the blunt bows of these boats. And it's really tragic. And ships, are blind to whales. So what we're proposing is basically having the signal identify the whale and where it is and have that come up on, looks like there's way too much text on this for radio. But let's see. If those of you can see in this upper right-hand corner here, the first panel here is wavelet analysis. It gives you very sharp distinction of the signals, and this left one here is a typical fast Fourier transform spectrogram. And so you can get a more precise identification not only of the whale and its call, but you can really individuate whales. So you can say, well, this is a blue whale named Morris, and this is a blue whale named Martha, and this is Zachariah over here. And so because you can identify them so precisely, we can then put automatic identification system tags on them, which is something that's used in navigation to, if you're a boater, you know that you can kind of look at the AIS system and see which boats are where and what they're carrying and where they're from and where they're flagged and what have you. And we can do the same thing with the whales and have those whales show up on screen in the wheelhouses of these boats, and that will go far in preventing ship strikes. Yeah, I didn't realize how much text was on this. That's the idea. Here's the gang here, the folks that we're working with on this project, and we're just basically working right now on proof of concept. And once we get that, I think that I can go back to writing my book about sacred architecture and have that just kind of make money for me. So, yeah, so that's it. I'm gonna take this off here, stop sharing the screen. Yeah, I should put together a deck that's a little less wordy. That was a sales deck more than anything else, but yeah, it's an interesting way of the way the wavelets work. So instead of running sound through a filter, they do a fast Fourier transform and measuring the output, which would transforms the actual sound in the time domain. Wavelets, like if you weren't dealing with gravity but bouncing a ball off the wall, and it's a flat wall, it'll come back directly to you. But if there's a little interruption in that wall, it'll bounce off another direction. So that the where that ball bounces off and the way it does that will give you an idea of the shape of that thing that you're bouncing off of. And it's used, I mean, we wouldn't be able to do this, 3 separate video screens on at the same time at the data rates we're talking about, because without this particular type of wavelet process. Essentially what it does, I mean, the backgrounds that we have, once it's identified that, it doesn't need to change it. The old raster, analog raster system, have 525 lines, and every time you do the line, it's going to say the same data if nothing's moving behind you. So this basically compresses it. If there's nothing moving, you don't need to repeat it. It's there. And so it just looks for, in large data sets, they use wavelet analysis also in large data sets. where there's no way you can paw through it and find any perturbations. But this process will really punch out, highlight perturbations, things that are different. And why that works so well is that we can identify each other's voices. I might have not had a conversation with somebody for 6 years, and they'll call me up on the phone, and I can immediately know who they are because there are certain characteristics in their voice which I hear and identify with those people. Well, it's not wavelet analysis per se, but wavelet analysis kind of works in the same way, where the slight differences in the voices are punched out, really accentuated. And so that's why you can identify different whales as different in different ways. So we're fundraising for this right now, and I don't know if there's people with lots of money who are listening to the program, but it will be a commercial project, and so at some point in time it will be profitable. Right now, as I say, we're looking for our first 100K to get the proof of concept together. But that's where we are on that. So did any questions come in as I was muddling away?
Nope, we don't have any that I can see with tree.
No, not just yet, but they still might. They still might. Could those funds go through your organization, Michael, Ocean Conservation
Yeah.
Research? Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Right now,
Great.
there would be a nonprofit donation.
Okay, that's wonderful. Very needed for sure. Yeah, great.
It's really, the way the whales, so we have two different mortality scenarios. One of them is pretty common to the blue whales and the larger, the sea whales, fin whales. They essentially are not used to anything larger than them in the ocean. They're not adapted to large things in the ocean, larger than them moving. And once they figure out, oh my God, what we're speculating is that they try to go where it's quietest, which is because most of the noise comes from propellers. They go in front of the boat, and it's quiet there, but they get hit.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the gray whales and humpback whales usually get ground up in the propellers. And our thoughts on that is that these animals are used to being predated upon by orcas, and so they have essentially evasion, escape mechanisms, and with that is diving. And when they dive, they get caught up in the propeller wash of these boats, and some of these propellers are larger than the whales.
Yes.
Even the small ones. I mean, there's pictures that we had in there of the slices. I mean, it's like horrible way to go. But so we could verify this if we were able to identify the whales. We could see what their behaviors are around. But I think more to the point is if they're on the screen of the ships and boats, people can slow down or evade them, get out of the areas. And so I think we can save a lot of whales that way. And again, as it's useful anywhere there's whales and ships, it's a global process. Could be really
Excellent. Thank you.
yeah.
All right. Well, that brings us up to our time, and just fascinating. I'm really interested in bioacoustics, so I would probably email you in the future. But for now, I'd like to thank Michael for sharing not only your research information, but also your unique insights and perspectives on ocean noise, as it's informed by your sense of hearing and your music. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. And if people are curious still, like OCR.org has a lot of different, papers and games for kids to play and all kinds of stuff on it. So and then we have a newsletter also, Ocean Noise newsletter, but you can subscribe to that through OCR.org. That's the easiest to remember. And thanks.
Both are great.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Bye for now.
Okay, bye for now.
And that was another excerpt here on KGA Live, where we are having the Ocean Life Symposium today. It'll continue till 3 o'clock. It is 12:55, and we'll be back at 1 with the next guest.
You're listening to KGUA 88.3 FM in Wallala, Aka Walali, Water Coming Down Place. And KBVE 107.9 FM in Boonville, California.